Hey everybody, welcome back to Parkitect. In the last episode we finished Archipelago Adventures, and today it's time for another adventure in Adventure Island. Now I want to talk about the scenario a little bit more than the scenarios so far, mainly because of the overall critical response, I guess you could call it, to this scenario. So this is one of the scenarios that I made, and I've seen that for a lot of people this is sort of a brick wall in difficulty. This one is quite a bit more difficult to complete than a lot of the scenarios that came before it. So if we look at the description, for instance, before we go into the design of the scenario itself, it says that this is a small island park with a unique observation tower that wants to attract more guests, but the cold and wet climate is keeping visitors away. So that's one thing. The climate of this scenario is not very conducive to finishing the scenario, so it's going to be cold and wet. And you can see it's minus 2 degrees already, so this ride is over here as a bit of a hint that it's probably best to try and build indoors whenever you can to get that rain protection. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And also we need to get a happiness rating of at least 80%, and I don't recall exactly if we've had that on earlier scenarios, but it's quite a difficult rating to get. I haven't completed the scenario myself, but it seems so far from my playthroughs of the other scenarios that getting ratings of above 80% is pretty difficult, so that's also going to be a bit of a challenge. But I think by far the biggest problem with this scenario, and the thing that makes it very difficult, is the fact that you start off with a pre-built park which has a number of issues. And in hindsight also, I'm not sure how happy I am with this scenario. In hindsight, I would have probably made the park much more functional, because this is one of the earlier parks in the scenario mode, even though we're getting somewhere near the halfway point at this point. But yeah, there's a number of issues with this park, and if you don't fix them, at least right from the start or as you're playing the scenario, it might become very difficult later down the road to get to that amount of guests or get the guests to be happy enough. So first of all, we've got the coaster, Killer Bee, over here, which I think it looks neat enough. But it's super inefficient because there are no block breaks anywhere on this thing except for the end. So it only runs 2 trains, and you can see that the trains are the typical Eurofighter vertical drop coaster trains, which aren't very good for efficiency, so that's a problem. It's also only $4.50 for a ticket, which is not nearly enough. I think you can ask around $15 for this. At least that seems to be a good amount so far for any thrilling coaster. You might be able to ask more money, but I'll leave it for 15 for now. Same actually goes for the Twister. Whenever you get rides at the start of a scenario, actually, I would highly suggest looking at the prices and see if there's anything that you can raise in there, because there often will be, and that's usually a good way to make things profitable. So with a $15 price, this ride should be decently profitable, but it's never going to make you that much money because it's just that inefficient. So that's one thing. Now there's also the observation tower over here, which is an elevator in it. So you can ask money for the elevator and earn money on the observation tower. But to be honest, what I think is probably the better decision here is to put a sign somewhere over here, blocking people from entering this whole area, because really this is a huge part of the challenge of the scenario. The map is quite large, and while that's not a problem per se, you can also always just start building somewhere and just move out from there. We've got this huge path leading almost throughout the whole map that we've got. So there's this really long stretch of path where there's no rides and no food or anything that people can spend money on. So this is making your park a lot less busy and less profitable. So really one of the first things that I'm gonna do to try and make this scenario a bit easier is put a sign somewhere in here, and every time I build some rides along this stretch of land, just move up that sign until eventually we get to the observation tower itself, and then I'll build some stuff around this. But yeah, that's something to keep in mind as well. And actually, I think that's just about it. So the existing rides and the way that the park is laid out is a huge problem with this map. And that's what a lot of the challenge, I think, comes from. If you manage to fix these issues by reworking it a little bit, I think the scenario should become pretty doable. I don't want to say too much here because I still need to finish this scenario. But yeah, this is where a lot of the challenge of this scenario comes from. So in hindsight, I would say to myself, I should have made the scenario a bit differently and made it easier, or at least more clear how to fix this. But for now, this is what we're set up with, and I'm gonna try my best to turn this failing, miserable little theme park into a successful one. So let's go. Alright then, here we go. And I'm gonna start the scenario by reworking some of the scenery that we get from the start, because this is all pretty simple and relatively sparsely themed, so I want to add some more detail and a few extra buildings to the area that we start out with. And actually, back when I was making this, I wanted to keep a lot of the scenery in many of the scenarios a little bit simple, so that it would be easy to emulate the style for players regardless of whatever skill level you have, or whether you're interested to play the scenarios from a scenery perspective like I'm doing, or whether you're more interested in just the gameplay aspect of it. So for that reason, a lot of the scenery is actually quite simple. But in my case, I do want to focus on the scenery, so I think it'll be just nice to add a little bit more detail into some of the things that's been built so far, rework some of the buildings, and also add this food court in here, because once I close off the part of the park with the observation tower, that's also where the existing food court is. So I'm gonna need something near the entrance area, just so people can get their food and their drinks, which in this case are, I think, just the coffee and pretzels, which is not the best choice, but I mean, it gives the guests the sustenance that they need, so I'm honestly just gonna stick with that for now. I also have a few other things that I actually want to address about this scenario and the coaster as well, that I forgot to mention in the intro, while I'm just building this small toilet building over here as another part of some extra scenery. So the coaster, even though it's a Eurofighter like some of the coasters that I've been building in the scenario playthroughs so far, is a lot more inefficient than any of the coasters that I've built in Nova Labs or in Mystic Oasis. Partly because the layout is just much longer. I didn't feel the need for extra additional block breaks in the middle of the layouts on the Eurofighters that I made in some earlier episodes, because their layouts are pretty short. But this layout takes a long time to complete, so that makes it take even longer for the cars to, wait for another car to complete the circuit before they can climb the lift hill. So that's one thing. And also the station is a terribly inefficient design, with one station with an exit and an entrance on both sides. And what I did with all of my Eurofighters so far is to have an exit station and an entrance station. So while one car is unloading, another car is loading passengers. So that makes it a little bit more efficient as well. And I suppose that goes as a small tip also for any other players. If you have these coasters with very small trains, or coasters that you want to quickly load and unload new cars on, having an exit station and an entrance station separately can really help to make the operations a bit smoother. So yeah, that's basically about the coaster. But yeah, about the difficulty in this park, some of it I think is quite well justified, like the weather, for instance, being quite difficult to manage, the goals being quite difficult, and also really the park that you start out with these rides that are underpriced and inefficient. I think that's fine as well, but the whole thing about the path leading up to this observation tower is kind of a problem that I was always super annoyed with roller coaster tycoon scenarios whenever they did this kind of thing. For me, Carts and Coasters sticks out the most as a park, where I always had to sort of redesign the park right at the start of the scenario to try and make it work. And to be honest, I always dislike it when you have to do this. So in hindsight, that's my biggest irk with this scenario as well. And one gripe then in hindsight, I should say, yeah, that's honestly a sort of an artificial difficulty of the scenario, and that sort of takes the fun out of it. So I guess to review my own kind of thing and try and be critical on myself there. That said, it is also something that once you do know how to get around it, it shouldn't be too much of an issue anymore. So I hope that I'm not gonna fail on this scenario. We'll see. I don't want to say anything too soon, but I think it should be alright. So for this part of the video, I decided to build a lot of flat rides instead of a roller coaster, just because I don't really have a good choice of a roller coaster to build. There's already the Eurofighter there, so that's not something that I can try. And the other options are a powered coaster or a junior coaster, and even though I want to get one of these in the park, just for aesthetic reasons, it's not going to give a lot of profits or allow people to spend more time and spend more money in the park, so I'm focusing on getting some of the thrilling flat rides in first. So hence why I'm building the drop tower over there, as well as the crazy, I forgot the name, crazy spinning, super thrilling, nauseating flat ride, and also this wave swinger. So I think that should be a better start to the scenario than building a coaster, because you do get some more value for your money with this. It's also a good way to give a bit of a layout to the park. I decided to have a pretty heavy use of paths without having any crazy patterns or anything like that, like I did in some of the earlier scenarios, because I'm trying to keep this quite simple and like it's a bit of a rustic, local kind of park. Inspired a bit by, I would say, American parks like Dollywood or Silver Dollar City, and honestly also the Bro Coaster's Planet Coaster Park, which has these really cool path elements at different elevations as well. There's always a lot of fun you can have with paths on different elevations and kind of diving underneath each other and things like that. So I decided to put a bit of that into the park as well, instead of going crazy with the path textures. It's mostly just going to be tarmac and wood for this park. So yeah, that's basically the start of the scenario, and I'm already earning some money with it, so that's pretty good. It looks like it's been functional so far. So let's go into a little bit of a short real-time overview and see how the park is doing before I continue. So I was wondering how the park would be doing at this early stage in the game, and to be completely honest, it's doing a lot better than I expected. My happiness rating is actually 100%. So that turned out to be nowhere near as hard to get as I remember. I think before I was mostly looking at the ratings left by your guests, which are a lot harder to get, and I'm not sure if this is how it works, and it's a little bit embarrassing that I don't know. But as far as I remember, the ratings that are left by your guests are this kind of exit poll as they exit the park, but then the ratings based on current factors are, you know, whatever the guests are thinking right now at the moment. So if you look at this, basically the current factors is like an average of all of these ratings of the guests in the park. So the ratings based on current factors are a lot more live data-ish, and the ratings left by guests, they only start improving once the guests start leaving the park and they get that kind of exit poll. So that's a pretty big division between how these stats work, because that means that getting the happiness to go up and all of those other factors is going to be a lot easier than the experiences and prices ratings. So that's something to keep in mind, and something that I wasn't thinking of before I went into the scenario. And also I'm on about 260 guests in the park, which is pretty good actually for this early in the game. I didn't build too much yet, but I think that despite being not very efficient, and this is a pretty important point I think, Killer Bee is really good at attracting people to the park and making them happy, because it's quite a good thrill ride. And even if it's really inefficient, it's got an extreme excitement rating, so it's still pretty good regardless of that. So really, I've seen some people play the scenario by deleting this coaster and using some of the money that you get from it, because you don't get all of the construction costs, to build a better coaster. But I'm actually not sure if that's the best way to approach this, because having this in here, it is pretty much a free coaster and a small head start to get you going. So even if it doesn't earn that much money, it's still something for the guests to come to your park for and to spend some time in. So I'm going to keep that around, and I think that's probably a good idea, and just keep building from here. So my plan is basically to build a small family coaster over here. I think that'll neatly round up this part of the park. Then we should be somewhere between 300 and 400 guests, and we'll hopefully have a little bit more money and some researched new coasters or something like that, to build a cool area over here as well, and hopefully that'll be enough to reach the goal of 500 guests. So without further ado, let's get back into building stuff. So once again, I'm building a family coaster, but this time I want to do it a little bit differently than everything so far. So most of the times that I've built one of these things so far, it's been just more of a kiddie coaster, just a very short and slow layout with a few helixes before you get back into the station. So this time I want to do a little bit more than that and make it more of a family ride, so something that can thrill the younger guests but still be approachable enough for older people or their moms or dads or whatever to ride as well. And I was mostly inspired by Verbolten, which is a Zierer family coaster in Busch Gardens, which is absolutely one of the best family coasters in the world, probably. It does a lot. It has a dark ride section, it has a launch, and just lots of elements, actually some elements that I don't want to spoil, because if you're ever gonna ride that thing, I think it's better to not know anything about it and not be like me, where you just try to find out everything about every coaster ever. But yeah, I was mostly inspired by that coaster, which looks kind of similar to this one in-game, I figured. Only difference is that it also has a triangular track, but I think this coaster type works well enough for what I'm trying to go for here. So for one, I've made the lift hill a little bit taller than I've usually made these things, but not that much, because I want to make use of the terrain here. So one of the really cool things that Verbolten does is halfway through the layout, it reaches this point where it goes down into a valley, and it has this mid-course brake run with a roof over it. And if I remember correctly, this is actually where an Arrow suspended coaster used to be before, which had a very similar drop, so it's kind of paying homage to that former ride. But at the same time, I think it looks really cool, so I wanted to build something like that on the river side. Or, no, actually, this is a pretty big body of water, isn't it? On the water side here. So that's something I'll get back to later, because I do want to theme that quite a bit. And then after that, the layout just kind of goes back and forth on this pretty lengthy section filled with airtime hills and helixes. So nothing too intense, but it's definitely a little bit more intense than the average kiddie coaster that I've been building so far. And especially after the brake run here, it hits a pretty intense point. It's quite a high top speed in there, and I bet this is a decently thrilling coaster, but still, I think it's at least doable for most families. So I was inspired by Verbolten also to put this little roof over the mid-course brake run. Not necessarily because there'd be any kind of pre-show or anything like that in here, but it just looks nice, so I liked to also emulate that. I guess also in the weather of this park, it would be pretty handy to have this little roof over the brake run here. Because if I remember anything being absolutely terrible on a roller coaster, it's if you're stuck on a brake run while it's raining and there's no cover over the brake run. That is absolutely horrid. That said, if all goes well, the trains should never have to stop on this brake run. But it's a good moment to kind of catch your breath before you plunge down into what's a pretty intimidating drop, if this is one of your first coasters of this size, for instance. So we've got that little house in there. I also wanted to actually build it slightly different than I usually do. So the walls of the building aren't actually walls. As you might have noticed, they are the shape pieces, just to make sure that I can build the walls on half a tile size, so that the roof can have this overhang, which is something that I usually don't do because it's quite difficult to pull that off. But since this is a pretty simple building, I think it works quite well, and it does a good job, I think, of selling the idea that this is some kind of overhanging wall, and it makes the building feel like it's a little bit less restricted by the grid. Now, one of my favorite parts of this ride, actually probably my favorite part of this ride, turned out to be the station. I didn't really expect too much of it. Usually I just go into these things without any plan and just kind of come up with what it's gonna look like while I'm building it. But this station actually turned out to be pretty nice, so halfway through this build I decided to actually put some extra effort into it. So we've got the basic generic rectangular shape of the station here, but to avoid that very boring rectangular feel, I wanted to have a small overhang toward the exit over there, so toward the front, in the that whole area with the chair swing. And then also a spire, because spires just make everything look so much nicer. And a bit of a more interesting roof shape as well, so it goes a little bit steeper in the middle of it. And I have to give credits here for the inspiration for this building to Astrotron on the Parkitect Discord server. I believe it was Astrotron, not entirely sure, but yeah, I'm pretty sure, who built this really amazing alpine building. And this building basically served as the inspiration for this station building right here. He very similarly had this kind of general layout of the building with the spire, and I thought that would be something really nice to follow and something that fits into the theme of this scenario, which, even though it's quite generic, I think the theme kind of comes through in the use of material and colors. So everything is quite brown and desaturated and using a lot of wooden materials and colors. So with that whole kind of basic idea of the theme, I think there's still a lot that you can do with the generic theme of this park. So yeah, that's basically the station. It also has this little interesting roof over the final brake run, which is partly because I think it looks quite nice. Without that, I feel like the station would look awfully rectangular and boxy, but also it's just another one of these things where if there is a train stuck in the station and you're arriving as the second train, you'll be stopped on that block brake section, so it's a little bit nicer to actually have a roof over that as well. So there's that. And also I decided to put a roof over the final part of the queue, because this is where you'll most likely have to wait, and this is a very rainy scenario after all, so I don't actually know if that, you know, makes the experiences for the guests any happier, if that increases their happiness rating, if they're able to find cover throughout the park, but at the very least it can't be a bad thing. So that's just something I wanted to add in there. And then there's finally a lot of foliage around this ride, just because I wanted to make it seem like it's really coursing through a forest. So that's basically it for this part of the video. I just want to take some time to look at the ride, and then we'll continue. So here's our thus far unnamed little terrain coaster, and this actually made me realize just how much I like building terrain coasters. It's really cool to be able to make use of the elevation to use up all of the energy that you build up with the lift hill. So as you can see, the lift hill isn't even that long, but you could still manage to get a long layout out of it, and by the final brake run it's lost most of its speed, but it doesn't really slow down too much throughout the layout. It more or less keeps the same kind of speed, so that's what I really like about terrain coasters. Definitely allows for a lot more creativity there. Actually, I maybe wanted to follow this for a little bit, but I can always save that for the end as well. That said, I've got a lot of comments about showing the ratings of coasters, and I'm sorry that I forgot to show this so far. I actually wanted to do that in the last episode as well, but I'm gonna have to make a little bit of a habit of that. But it seems like the ratings for this aren't too good. Obviously the intensity rating is still pretty low because there's nothing really intense happening here. But that said, for the guests who are okay with that, I can still ask a decent amount of money for this actually, because the excitement rating is actually still quite high. And then decoration is amazing, but I've also noticed that the amazing decoration, or at least the high decoration, is quite as standard for most of my coasters so far. So it shouldn't be too difficult to get that. But then again, I think the station and this building over here are what really contribute to that high rating. So yeah, overall I'm actually really happy with this coaster, and it also fits the space that I had available quite well. And there's even some nice moments of path interaction. So over here you can actually have a pretty cool view of the coaster, and the queue also has some nice interaction with the final part of the layout as well. So yeah, overall this is actually one of my favorite layouts of the playthrough so far. Now as for the park itself, we're making a good amount of money, actually even more than I used to, so that's really good. And also I've gotten some good rides for the, well, whatever I'm gonna expand in over here. I can even put this thing indoors, which is gonna be handy for the rain. And finally, the coasters aren't too great yet, but from the research that I've seen so far, I'm gonna get the stand-up coaster next, and I really want to build that because I haven't built it so far in the playthrough. So yeah, I think that's going to be interesting. So without further ado, let's get back to building some stuff. Alright, now before I get into the stand-up coaster, and I'm sorry for teasing you a little bit, I didn't realize when I was recording the last clip that I would spend more time doing other stuff. First, I want to add a staff room and a training room, because I didn't do that so far, and not having these in your park can become pretty problematic over time as well, so I thought it would be good to add these while we were at it. And also a few covers underneath the coaster tracks, and this is something that I don't always point out, but in real life, if a coaster is very close to a path or going just right over it, there's usually coaster nets or some kind of roof to prevent loose articles from people riding the coaster from, hitting people's heads or any other body parts on the paths down the track. So that's just a bit of a safety thing that I like to put in the game as well, just to make things feel a little bit more realistic. And after that, I moved on to a few flat rides that I wanted to build before I got into the stand-up coaster. And the first one is this Riptide over here. And yeah, the reason that I built this thing is actually that I thought it would be great to put this under a roof for another indoor flat ride. But in hindsight, that was actually a terrible idea, because these things turn out to be pretty tall when they start doing their spinning thing, and I didn't really account for that. So this building ended up being much taller than I expected beforehand, and it looks a little bit clumsy, so I spent quite a good deal of time trying to figure out how to make this building look a little bit nicer and incorporate it a little bit better in the surrounding areas. What I ended up going for is just this very generic shed style structure, I suppose. But covering the exit and the entrance in such a way that it sort of helps the building get some, lower parts to not make it just this straight box that's really big in the middle of the park, but also have some extra decoration and things on the side of it to make it blend in a little bit nicer with the rest of the park. I think in the end it works alright, but it's definitely not the best ride to put indoors. You can also see that every now and then I messed up and it was sticking through the walls or the roofs of the building, and I had to adjust some things. But in the end, it should be safe, and it works in terms of the rain protection, so that's quite good. I also have to say that I didn't really have much better rides at my disposal. A lot of the rides in this park are actually quite large, so it's hard to put them under a roof. Maybe it's because I got unlucky with the research, or it's just because I don't want to put too much effort into putting roofs over rides. But that was definitely part of the struggle as well. Now the next ride that I put into the park is this G-Lock, and I don't know if this is the first G-Lock that I'm building in the campaign mode, but it's definitely one of the first. It's one of those slightly more rare rides, but it's quite good in game. It has some decent stats, and I should also say in real life this is one of my favorite flat rides. I rode it first in Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen last year, and I didn't expect this to be a ride that I liked, because I don't handle rides that do multiple directions of rotation very well. I kind of get quite nauseous quickly, but this thing didn't end up making me as nauseous as I expected, and the forces that you get on this are actually really cool. So this is slightly different, I think, from the one in Tivoli, since that one is only 2 seats per arm. But the overall idea of the ride is very similar, so these things actually get a thumbs up from me, and I like to put them in parks whenever I can, because they're a nice ride to look at. They're fun to see their whole rotation thing go around. It has so many ridiculous moving parts, and it's just a fun ride in general. Now moving on, we finally get the stand-up coaster here. And this is actually quite an interesting experience for me at the time. This is actually my first Togo stand-up coaster that I'm building in the game, because this is one of the most recent additions to the coaster roster. It might have actually been the most recent addition. And since it's been added, I've only played campaign mode, and you don't get this coaster very often in campaign. At least I haven't gotten it very often so far. So yeah, I just haven't gotten around to building one of these, but I actually like these, and that's a bit of a hot take actually. So for those of you who aren't as much of a coaster nerd as I am, This is a Togo stand-up coaster, and people usually call it that because the company that makes them, which is a Japanese company, is called Togo, and it's notorious for being absolutely terrible at making roller coasters. A lot of their coasters are very uncomfortable, a little bit old, and quite simple. They don't do a lot of interesting things, and when they tried to do that, it usually failed pretty miserably. So yeah, they don't have a really good reputation, but I do think they are underrated and maybe even hated more than they deserve, because when you look back at it, they were actually the company that invented the stand-up coaster and built the first stand-up coaster. And back in the days, they were actually quite trailblazing. It's just that a lot of their rides have aged quite poorly, and also Togo built a lot of coasters in America that were usually quite bad, and I don't know what this was related to exactly. I've heard some stories about it being simply that the manufacturers in America, because I don't think they transported the track pieces to America, but rather they had a plant in America where they built their stuff, that the manufacturer locally wasn't quite as good. And also, America just got unlucky. I think a lot of the good Togos that do exist are mostly in Japan, and for my money, I've been able to ride two of them, among which actually the first stand-up coaster. It wasn't originally built as a stand-up coaster, but it got these stand-up coaster trains to ride in Yomiuri Land, and I expected it to be very painful, but it was actually quite smooth and a really fun ride experience. Given that the restraints weren't too comfortable, the ride itself was actually not too rough and quite comfortable, and the forces that you get in the loop are actually really cool, because you're standing on your feet, so you really feel all of the G-forces like pull all of your blood down to your feet, and it's really cool, especially because their loops are a little bit circular, so really heavy G-forces in there. So yeah, altogether, I like this ride, I like this coaster type. There were probably some really bad ones out there, but my experience with it so far is quite good, and I like it in-game as well. It has a really cool track design, and it's just one of those rides that you don't build too often. It's a little bit of a gimmick ride, but yeah, I like it, so it gets a thumbs up from me. And incidentally, I should also say that the other Togo coaster that I've been on is Bandits in Yomiuri Land, which at the time when it was built, I believe was the fastest coaster in the world, and the height difference between its lowest and highest point is actually somewhere around 70 meters. It's actually insane, and really, even though it's not officially a hyper coaster, it sort of is the first hyper coaster, and apparently it was the inspiration for the first actual hyper coaster being built. So really also quite a good coaster, and I think it's even held up quite well over the years. It's not super smooth, but it's decently smooth, definitely not painful, and it has some really good moments. In any case, God, I said it again. I can't stop myself there. I'm sorry, guys. I reached the scenario goals there in the middle of my time-lapse because I wasn't paying attention. So we're gonna miss out on the confetti later on. But I decided to fill in the remaining space that I had left with a suspended coaster, just because I felt partly that this was a good way to round up the types of coasters that we have. You know, you have two very thrilling, intense coasters with the Eurofighter and the stand-up coaster, and then two more family coasters with the suspended and the family coaster. I guess that works. So it's also quite nice because these coasters, I think, are best when they're able to use their terrain to an advantage. So I tried as much as I could to build this up to the hill and maintain a very similar speed throughout the ride by having the first sections of the ride be more uphill and having the lower sections kind of cross the water like that. At some point I also thought that this would be a good idea and extending it over to the other side of the path, but that really didn't work too well. I think it's more realistic to keep it just on this side of the hill and finish it here. So both of these coasters also have pretty simple color schemes. I wanted to go for these color schemes because I think they work quite well together when you see the park from a distance. And it was a little bit inspired also by Japanese theme parks, which very often just have these really simple color schemes and really simple looks to their coasters. And I don't know what made me think of a Japanese park when I was looking at this map. But it's partly just that Togo coaster being over there and having such a typical Japanese coaster layout. Very simple, kind of low tech actually. Not to be too insulting there, but there's just a certain look to Japanese parks that would actually be really cool to try and recreate at some point in time. Maybe I'll do that on one of the Japanese scenarios that are gonna come up, but I should probably not spoil too much about that. So I've also missed a ride which I placed on the waterfront there. That's just a small plain carousel. Get another ride in for the kiddies. Also a good ride to put a roof over, so that's something that I'll do later on. And in the meantime, I decided to work a little bit on the foliage on the side of the suspended coaster. One of the things that these coasters also do really well is explore these natural areas that they're built into. I really love it when these suspended coasters just kind of swing their way through a forest and up and down various hills. It's just a coaster that's so good at exploring the natural terrain that's around it. And I found some inspiration, I guess, here from a roller coaster called Eagle's Fortress in Korea, which is generally known as one of the best roller coasters to have ever been built, and yet it's been out of... I think, yeah, it hasn't been removed. I'm not sure if it's been removed, but it's been standing but not operating for a really long time. And the thing is that only a few roller coaster enthusiasts from the US have been on this thing, but almost everybody who has been on it has been raving about it. So you could see a POV on YouTube. You could see that it swings way more than any coaster should. It definitely looks like it wasn't designed to swing as much as it does, but because of that, it's a really intense and unique ride, or it was at least, and probably just the perfect example of a suspended coaster and what it can do. It's really amazing at going up and down these hills and just crashing through these forests while swinging in some crazy directions. Just a really cool coaster that's both intense but also super scenic. So yeah, if you're into watching POVs on YouTube of random coasters, I highly recommend checking out Eagle's Fortress. It's really interesting to watch how, especially toward the end of the ride, it goes absolutely haywire and swings in crazy directions. Anyway, that's just about it for this park. So let's take a quick look at how it's doing. Alright, so here's the finished park. So I just want to give a quick overview of what everything looks like and also what some of the stats and things like that are on these coasters. So first off, we've got the suspended coaster over here, which is actually not that great in terms of stats, and this is making me think that this might not be the greatest ride for scenario play. But that said, I am actually really happy with how the layout turned out. A lot of these will kind of go back and forth like this through the forest on some kind of hillside. I know some of them have some really cool path interaction as well, or interaction with some kind of lake in the center of a park. I believe the one in Cedar Point does that, for instance. But this one is probably most similar to Eagle's Fortress, except a little bit less intense. I also just found out that it has been removed. According to Roller Coaster Database, it's been removed in 2015. So that's very sad to see, but at least you can always find it on the internet, and it's archived in POV videos. For now though, let's just follow this thing as it goes around in the other train, that is. So this one is definitely not as intense, but I still think it does some decent swinging. It's really hard to predict it. S-bends like this are really good for the swinging, as are just a short straight section in the middle of some curves. So yeah, altogether, not too bad, even if it isn't that intense, and really just more of a decent family ride. I think these things are also best when they come really close to the ground, just because that, I don't know, that feels very scary for a lot of these rides. The only one that I've been on is Ninja in Six Flags Magic Mountain, but whenever it almost touches the ground, for me that's always the most fun parts of these rides, especially when it swings a lot at the bottom of those drops and it's close to the ground, almost touching the trees. That's what these things do really well, I think, just that general interaction with the scenery around them. And then over here we've got the stand-up coaster with some really good earnings actually, and some really good stats as well. We've got an extreme excitement rating, so that's super good actually. Let's follow this thing as it goes around. This is also one of the most popular, actually this is the most popular ride in the park. The trains are almost always full, which is really cool to see. So over here, for instance, this is a very janky transition, but that's just how Togo does it, so I think that fits the layout most of all. Into double corkscrew and some more janky transitions and simple curves. Some people call this the Japanese helix of death, or the Togo helix of death. Many Togos have this crazy helix on it. That's just the Togo thing, so I decided to put that on this layout as well. And yeah, that's it for this ride. So altogether, I actually really like the way that these two coasters look together on this hillside. I decided to keep this open a little bit more, because when everything is forest, you can't really see the forest through the trees. You need to have some planes everywhere just to be able to tell where the forest is. So on this ride, it's more forest, which I think fits the type of ride that it is. And this one is more kind of built on the plains on this hill. So yeah, this is actually my favorite part of the park. I didn't expect it to work out this well, but the overall look of the two coasters, as well as this area with all the different flat rides, is actually quite cool. Now, I haven't talked about the top spin during the time lapse, but I decided to set this up in a way that you're actually looking toward the sea, and there's not much of a barrier here actually. Maybe not the safest thing, but I really like it, and of course there's also sort of an audience for this ride, but that said, with it being turned toward the sea, you are looking to the back of these people. Kinda wish that it were a top spin like Talocan in Phantasialand is, for instance, where you've got seats facing two different sides, which is quite cool. Although in Talocan it's a bit annoying, I think, because it means that you have the odds of possibly staring at a wall for the majority of the ride. And even though it's a really nice wall, it's not the best thing. So that's those rides. We've already checked this one out, and might as well do a quick POV of Killer Bee. I mean, it's out there anyway. So this is Killer Bee doing its thing. I do like the layout for this thing. Again, it's not a very efficient coaster, and it being here in the scenario isn't even that much of a help at the start. But still, it's something fun to just look at and see it go around. So actually, something that I do want to talk a bit about, for at least shortly in this video, is a comment that I got on the last video, giving me the idea to maybe pause the game while I'm building, and then letting the game play to see the guests come in and see how the park is running. And I have to say, I like the idea, especially for these video, for this time-lapse and real-time video concept, where you could sort of focus the time-lapse on just making things look as nice as possible, and then having the real-time sections focus more on how the park ends up working. So for the next video, I want to try that, at least at the start. But I also have to say, I just like to keep the game unpaused while I'm playing, and maybe this is just because I'm used to playing the old school Roller Coaster Tycoon games when you were not allowed to pause the game while you were building things. Or maybe it's just because I like to see the park go around while I'm building stuff, and kind of do some multitasking where I'm building while also trying to manage the park in real time. I think there's a lot of the fun of these games kind of revolves from that for me as well, trying to tend to different things at the same time. Oh god, this thing looks so cool. It's definitely a little bit slower than the real life counterpart, but still, actually maybe that's because it's at the end of the, it's at the end of the cycle. But yeah, where was I actually? Right, the pausing and unpausing. But I do want to try it for the next video, but I have to be honest, I'll probably stick with what I'm doing right now and the way I'm playing right now, just because for me that's just the most fun way to do things. Anyway, let's wrap up this park. So sort of split into two areas. One last thing that I actually never talked about is I tried to make this area look a little bit more modern. So this is some of the more fancy stuff, also the observation tower, some slightly different paths and more of the buildings, whereas the other part of the park is more just foliage and some simple asphalt paths. So there's definitely a slightly different vibe over here, but I do think it all fits together quite nicely. But yeah, really that's the basic setup. I think it's been a decent way to fill in this island, even though it's quite large. And with that all said, I think it's a good time to check out what else we've got. So unfortunately, I can't show you the animation of getting the trophy here, but obviously you get the observation tower, which they point right on the top of the island over here, which actually looks pretty cool. I really like this as a trophy. Not to subtly brag about myself here, the way that they implemented it into the map looks really cool. So over here we have Ice Shelf Islands, but that's not the only scenario that we've got from the finishing Adventure Island here. We also got Biscayne Beach, and I've heard a lot of stories about Biscayne Beach. This is another one of those scenarios that a lot of people seem to struggle with. And actually the same goes for Ice Shelf Islands, because it's a very different theme, and I've heard that the terrain is quite difficult as well as the research. So both of these are going to be very interesting. I think I'm gonna do Ice Shelf Islands first and then get back to Batavia Cay, because that's been there for a while, and I just want to do Ice Shelf Islands for now because we've had quite a few tropical island maps, so I think it'll be nice to switch it up a little bit and go to pretty much the opposite of that. So next time I'll try and work on a decent Ice Shelf Islands. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you all next time.